How's it going? My name's Dim, and in this episode we will be adding some features to the front end of our file storage service. In the last episode we implemented a bunch of endpoints. In this episode we'll be making API calls from the front end and displaying the user's files with the ability to manage those files. Here you'll see me sketch out the general design of the site. I'm doing this so you can have an idea of what we're trying to achieve. With all that said, let's jump right into it. For starters, let's get rid of this form. The thing with forms is that to submit it, the user must be redirected to a new page. This is not the behavior I want. Instead, when a user drags and drops a file, it should be uploaded immediately without having to click any other button or being redirected to a new page. First off, let's add the ability to sign in and out and display the name of the user that signed in. To do this, we'll create a div with an onClick event that calls a function. I end up calling this function sign in or out. In this function, we'll check if the current user is an anonymous user. If they are, the function will prompt the user to sign in with our Google provider. If the user is not anonymous, we'll sign them out. This will fire off the onAuthStateChanged event and sign the user in anonymously. Let's test out our code in the browser. We get an error in our console that sign in or out doesn't exist. This is because the code we copied from Firebase has script type equals module. This means that the variables we define in that script tag are not global. To get around this, we can define sign in or out on the window object and access it globally. With that done, we can run our code once more. Alright, let's just comment out that line for now. And clicking does nothing. Well, this is because we actually have to call the function in our onClick attribute, since everything in that gets treated as JS code. After fixing that, let's try clicking on the element once more. And that seems to work quite well. Clicking it again signs us out and then signs us in anonymously. Now, let's make it so that when someone signs in, we make a call to our /login endpoint. Remember, this endpoint transfers ownership of files for a user uploaded while signed out, allowing them to keep the files when they sign in. We can figure out if a user is signed in by keeping track of the previous user state and comparing it with the new user state in onAuthStateChanged. First, initialize the previous user state outside of the callback function. Then, at the end of the callback function, set the previous user to that current user, so that on the next callback we have access to the previous user. With access to both, we need to check two things. 1. Is the previous user anonymous? And 2. Is the new user not anonymous? For the first, we can use optional chaining because we want prev and prev.isAnonymous to be true. For the second, we need to check if u is true and if u.isAnonymous is false. So we can't use our optional chaining here. Now that we're sure the user has moved from an anonymous to a non-anonymous account, let's just make a call to the /fetch endpoint. For this, we will be using the JavaScript fetch API, which is perfect for making API requests. We can supply a method, which in this case is post, a body, which in this case we need to json.stringify an object that holds our previous access token and our current access token. Finally, we can set the content type header to be application/JSON, since the body we're sending is in JSON format. This method does return a promise, so we need to make our callback function async in order to await that promise. Now, after sending the login request, let's fetch our user's files. We do this by making a GET request to /files with our access token in the authorization header. GET is the default fetch method, so we don't have to set it in our options. Now, since we want to parse the body of this request as JSON, we are going to use the response.json method, which also returns a promise, like you see here. Here, I decide to do a bit of refactoring. Since we are only calling the /files endpoint when the user signs in, we should instead be calling it anytime the user changes. To do this, we just compare the old user ID with the new one. Now let's call a function which doesn't exist yet, called renderFileView. RenderFileView is going to be the function we call throughout the program every time our files change. Since we are not using a framework, we have to be conscious of when our files change and render them ourselves. For now, let's just make renderFileView console.log. Going back to our site to test it, we can see our files in the console. Signing out, we get an error, cannot read properties of null. Oops. Let's add that optional chaining operator. Well, now we have another issue, which is that if u is null and prev.uid is defined, the comparison will be true, but u doesn't exist. So we get that cannot read properties of null error when trying to get the access token. What that means is we have to also add a check if u is not null. It's at this moment that I realize all three if statements are checking u, so I decided to refactor it a bit. With that done, let's test it out. Let's show the user their name when they're signed in and make it clear that the div lets you sign in or out. To do this, I'm making two spans with different IDs that we can reference in our code. Let's log the user again so we can figure out what property we want to use. It seems like display name is quite useful. Let's set the inner text of our name element to u.displayname or anonymous if the user does not have a display name. For the subtext, let's make it login if the user is anonymous and log out if the user is not anonymous. Here you see me moving that into our if statement since we need to check if the user exists. That seems to be working just fine. We can worry about the styling later. With that done, let's move on to uploading files. I want users to be able to either click and select a file or drag and drop to upload a file. Before that, let's just make a small modification to our backend code. In our post/files endpoint, let's just use an authorization header for verifying requests rather than the token form value. Let's go back to our front-end code and to that file input field. We don't need the parameter anymore, so let's get rid of that. Let's add the multiple parameter to allow for multiple file uploads at once. I'm just changing the ID here to upload out of personal preference. Now let's add some event listener to this element. As you can see, I'm referencing this code pen that I found to determine the events I want to listen for. First, let's set on drag enter, on focus, and on click. When any of these fire, that means the user is interacting with the file upload element and it is active. Conversely, on drag leave, on blur, and on drop occur when the user stops interacting with the file upload element. Finally, the on change event is fired when the user selects or drops a file. This is where we will send our file upload requests. Now, in that first callback we made, let's add the active class so we can style this later. In the second callback, let's remove the active class. In the last callback, let's send those files. To do this, we're going to iterate over the file input element's files field. For each file, we're going to make a post request to the /files endpoint. Here you can see me setting the content type to application/xwww form URL encoded. But this is not what you want to do, and you'll shortly find out why. The body is going to be a form data object. Let's not forget that we need to set the authorization header in order for the server to identify us. Our Firebase token can be accessed through auth.currentUser.accessToken. Now, let's append our file to the form data object. Remember, we called this field file in our backend, so let's do the same here, calling it file. For the value, we can just pass our file object that we're iterating over. With all that done, let's test it out. We end up getting a bad request error. Our backend tells us that we set the wrong content type. Let's change this to multipart/form data and try again. Another bad request error. No multipart boundary param in content type. I don't even know what this means. Lucky for me, when going back to the Stack Overflow thread that I was referencing, I noticed that at the bottom of the answer, the user writes, make sure to not set the content type header, but we are setting the content type header. So let's get rid of that. Let's run this one more time, and finally our post request is working. Now, let's list the files we've uploaded and give users the ability to delete files. To do this, let's actually do something inside of our render file view function. Render file view takes a list of files, so let's just keep track of those files with a global variable called all files. Let's set all files to whatever gets passed into the files parameter. The reason for doing this is that we want to keep track of the files we fetched and also add to and take away from the array as the user uploads and deletes files. Now let's go back to our onChange function and get the data about our newly uploaded file. To do this, we have to make our function async and await the response of our fetch request. We can then call the JSON method to decode the body, and that returns a promise, so let's await that too. Now that we have the file data, let's call our render file view function with the file data prepended to all the existing files. Newer files should come first, and that's why we're prepending rather than appending. With that done, let's create a div where we can list the uploaded files. Inside of that renderFileView function, let's reference that div we created. We are going to iterate over the files we are rendering, and for each file, append some HTML to the parent element. I'm using template literals here because they let you write multi-line strings and easily write expressions within the string. Let's create an anchor element that links to the file and display the file's name like so. Testing that out, we can finally see our files now. Let's just add target equals blank so that when we click on these files, they are open in a new tab instead of on the same page. Clicking around, that seems to work pretty well. Now, let's also add a delete button for each file. For this, we're going to use a span element with the onClick property. Here, I'm just adding some classes so we can style these later. Inside of that onClick property, let's just call the function deleteFile with the ID of the file. Remember that file.id is a string, so we have to wrap it in quotes. We have not yet created the deleteFile function, so let's go make it. Just like with our sign-in or out function, let's assign deleteFile to the window. DeleteFile will take a file ID and make a fetch request to delete the file. Here, I'm just copying some code we wrote earlier. The fetch request will be to /files/fileID. The method of this request is delete. The request shouldn't contain a body, so let's remove that. And in our headers, we want to send our access token, which once again can be retrieved using auth.currentUser.accessToken. After deleting the file, we want to remove it from our all files array. To do this, we can call the filter method and filter only files whose ID is not the ID of the file we just removed. Here, I forget to call renderFileView, so let's do that instead of setting the all files variable. Let's test that out. Clicking our delete button, we get more files. At first, I assumed that we are continuously adding more files to the all files variable, so I poked around the code looking for what could be doing that. That's when it hit me. We are constantly adding new elements inside of our parent element, but we are not removing the previous elements that were there. All we have to do to fix that is to clear out the inner HTML of the parent element before adding more elements. With that done, our delete button seems to work perfectly. We can even upload many files at once. Look at that. If we upload files while anonymous, then sign in, we can see those files get transferred to our signed in account. Isn't that just great? I'm very happy with our progress so far. We've added an endpoint to upload files, an endpoint to list the files we've uploaded, an endpoint to view the contents of a file, an endpoint to delete a file, and an endpoint to transfer ownership from an anonymously uploaded file to an account. We've created a front end that allows users to sign in with Google, upload, view, and delete files with the click of a button. There are so many more features we could add and technologies we could use. We can create an admin panel to see all the files users have uploaded. We can impose restrictions on file types, file sizes, user account, file storage limits. We can add paid plans to allow for more account storage. We can add the ability to create temporary files that expire after some time. We can utilize object storing services like Amazon S3 so that we're not limited by just the system storage. The possibilities are truly endless, but I think this is a good stopping point for now. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. I know that the method we used here for creating an interactive single-page app isn't exactly conventional, and I'm sure you're more used to seeing something like React, Vue, Svelte, Angular, all that good stuff getting used for this kind of thing. Although these are excellent tools, I wanted to stick to just plain old JavaScript to keep the series simple and prove that you don't need those complex tools to create something simple like this. In the next episode, we'll be doing some front-end styling to get our app looking at least presentable. We will definitely be facing some challenges getting our input field to look nice, but with the help of Google, we do end up overcoming that. Anyway, thank you for watching, and until then, stay tuned and peace out.